The spring break, according to CUNY. New York has this wonderful habit of every institution declares its own spring break. So you often find yourself in a situation where you're on a spring break and nobody else in the family is, and then the next week they're on spring break and you're not. So, but anyway, it's a CUNY spring break next week, so we will not be having a class. The topic this week is a little bit confused by the ordering, because this tends to happen, of course, because Marx, if he thinks about something, just goes off and writes about it, no matter whether it's immediately connected or not. But there are a number of digressions here. One of the features which crops up in this section is the beginnings of a concern with something called fixed capital and the circulation of fixed capital. I sort of took that out of the equation, and so I'm not talking about that here, because next week we get into fixed capital in very, very seriously, with a little bit of a relationship to what is going on here. But what I would immediately say is that Marx actually comes up in this section with the idea of fixated capital. Now, this is a typical Marx thing, that things like fixed capital don't get superimposed from outside. They arise organically within the argument. And fixated capital arises because in the circulation of capital in general, there are times when commodities or money or production is not moving. And Marx kind of says that since capital is value in motion, if they're not moving, then they're not being capital. So Marx talks about this as fixated. So, for example, a large inventory of unsold goods would be described as fixated capital. A large inventory of unused raw materials is fixated capital. Now, of course, later on, Marx is going to be talking about fixed capital. But what I want to suggest to you is that the organic origins of fixed capital really lie in this section, in the discussion of fixated capital. And fixated capital comes about because in this section, Marx is beginning to talk about the relationship between production and circulation. And instead of seeing them as somehow or other separate from each other, he's really starting to talk about the way in which they merge. And that therefore they are just two moments in a process. And since they're two moments in a process, you can't say, well, one is more important than the other. Because it's the process is what's important, and the process takes on the forms of production and the forms of circulation and realization. So he says, when he returns to the main argument after a digression about Malthus and all the rest of it, he says this. This is on page 620. The total production process of capital includes both the circulation process proper and the actual production process. Now, I've mentioned to you before, when Marx uses circulation, he has these two meanings. One is circulation in the market, separate from production, but then there comes the meaning where he's talking about the circulation as something, a part of the totality. And here he's saying the circulation process proper and the actual production process. These form the two great sections of its movement. So the important thing here is the movement, and it's just going through two sections, which appears as the totality of these two processes. On one side, labor time, on the other, circulation time. And the whole of the movement appears as unity of labor time and circulation time, as unity of production and circulation. The unity itself is motion, process. Capital appears as this unity and process of production and circulation, a unity which can be regarded both as the totality of the process of its production, as well as the specific completion, one turnover of the capital, one movement returning into itself. So capital then is understood as the totality of this movement. And you start to think of it in those terms, and you see that the process goes through two moments, two phases, if you like. And what has been talked about as something separate, that is production and circulation, is here seen as submerged within the generality of capital as motion, capital in the totality of its movements. So value in motion is going to be the definition. And what Marx does then is to then sort of say, well, while we have set up this idea that it's really the motion between production and circulation, there are some aspects of this which need to be looked at more closely, because the speed of circulation through circulation and the speed of motion through production, they vary somewhat. And so we have to start to actually recognize that although everything is subsumed within the motion, it's like it's subsumed, but there are different resistances, if you like, within the realm of production, as opposed to the kinds of resistances you might encounter within the circulation process. So he says a little bit further on, the repetition of the production process is determined by circulation time, which is equal to the velocity of circulation. Now we're talking about the totality of circulation. The more rapid the circulation, the shorter the circulation time. And the more often can the same capital repeat the production process. Hence, in a specific cycle of turnovers of capital, the sum of values created by it, hence surplus value as well, is directly proportional to the production time and inversely proportional to the circulation time. This then leads Marx to start to talk about the impulsion that exists within capital to cut down on circulation time, that is the circulation time in the market. And if you can do that, and you can shorten the overall circulation time, you can actually increase value production. And so he gets into this idea that the turnover time is going to be crucial in looking at value production. For example, suppose you have a production process that takes a month, and then the circulation time is 2 months before you get back the money formed. Then the money can go back into production again and produce some more. But if you can cut down that circulation time, then the money can go back much more quickly into production. And instead of having surplus value production once in a cycle, you can have surplus value production 3 times. So you can increase the surplus value production by reducing the time in market circulation. So there is an interest, says Marx, in perpetually reducing circulation time to 0. Now, where can what are the implications of that? The implications are that you need a marketing system which is going to instantaneously get rid of the product. That if instead of it taking 3 months to get out there, you're going to get rid of it in 20 minutes. And he kind of goes, well, therefore you want to start to produce things that have a very short circulation time. Now, this is one of my big arguments right now, that when you sort of say what has a short circulation time, well, capital has shifted from producing things to producing experiences, because experiences are instantaneously over. So there's been a tremendous kind of flow of capital into the production of spectacle and the production of experiences. And you get, the kind of the Netflix economy. You get the cultural events, the Olympic Games, the World Cup. There's been a tremendous, because all of those are forms of commodities which have not a zero circulation time, but once the game is over, the game's over. So it's all done in one. So there's a lot of capital goes into it, and a lot of capital flows out because you can charge highly for it. But the actual time of circulation is very weak, is very low. So Marx actually talks in here saying, well, the optimal time of circulation is going to be zero, which means that it then appears as if circulation time is itself productive of surplus value. Now, one of Marx's arguments is that surplus value is created in production, realized in the market. But here you've got a situation where if you cut down on the realization time and the circulation time in the market, and you do more and more of the circulation process in production, you're going to get more and more surplus value. So, does this undermine Marx's position, which says that surplus value production only occurs in the production process? Because you can clearly see that as circulation time is reduced, so the capacity to produce surplus value increases, and therefore you're going to get more surplus value. So Marx kind of sort of leaves it there without giving a clear answer, except that there's a hint of what the answer might look like, which is in exactly the same way that reducing circulation time gives you an advantage in terms of the capacity to produce more surplus value. So an encounter with a resource which is particularly rich and very cheap can also have the same effect. So what he's going to say is that the conditions of production do have an effect on the capacity to produce surplus value. They don't produce surplus value in themselves, but they change the conditions under which surplus value is produced, and to the degree that they allow for more surplus value production, movement onto more fertile soil, movement in such a way as to reduce circulation time, all of these things create conditions which permit greater levels of surplus value production. So that's the argument which is going on here. And it's an interesting argument, and I think it's again interesting that Marx would spot that back in 1858. And so now I can sort of go on, well, the society of the spectacle that Guy Debord talked about in 1967 turns out to have become, a very, very large part of what capital is about. Think of a cruise, for example, a cruise liner. Those huge cruise liners came on, started to arrive around 1990, and now they're all over the place. Had a hard shot, of course, when the epidemic came, but they're trying to revive them. So you get a cruise liner kind of productive capacity. Again, look at the cruise liner. It employs a lot of labor, a lot of people employed. And a lot of people are served. There's about usually 2,000 or 3,000 people employed, or 2,000 or 3,000 people being served. The fixed capital is enormous, the cruise liner, the consumption of ecological, cultural heritage and all the rest of it is strong. So just think of the economics of the cruise liner and say, well, you know, this is the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable in the 1960s. Nobody would really want to do it. But capital has found ways to reduce circulation time, particularly in the realm of consumption. So instantaneous consumerism has become very much embedded in our economic system. So this is also something which I think is worthwhile considering, and it arises in here, and it also arises in another sense. There's a point where Marx starts to talk about a little earlier on. He starts to talk about the way in which wealth is created. And back on page 590, he says this: only capital has subjugated historical progress to the service of wealth. And it's only, just add up to this, and the only kind of wealth that matters to capital is, of course, monetary wealth. And what Marx does at this point is to say, but there are other ways to think about wealth. And one of them is to think of wealth as free time. And what you get here is an argument of, well, free time is in fact a measure of wealth, which, you know, for Marx anyway, is radically different from that which is given by capital, which is wealth measured in terms of monetary form. Free time. But notice there's a conflict here. On the one hand, we're seeing huge pressures to reduce the turnover time in circulation to zero, which means that people are going to have to be instantaneously engaged. And at the same time, what we're seeing, and the development of a market for that, and cruise lines and watching Netflix and in the last, you know, Succession or whatever, you know, thing you're into, Game of Thrones or whatever. So on the one hand, you've got this tremendous pressure to that. On the other, you have the notion that somehow or other there's a world out there which is capable of yielding free time, open time, time to do whatever you want. And one of the arguments about what goes on in capitalist society is that we have all of this technological capacity, time-saving equipment, time-saving of images and all these kinds of things. There's a lot of time-saving capacity there, but most people feel they have less and less time and less free time. So that free time is disappearing. And Marx's point is to kind of say, well, you understand why free time is disappearing, because it is within the laws of capital that that is likely to happen. But if you have a concept of socialism that talks about free time, and as much free time as possible, then clearly there's a point of opposition here. But psychologically, we are caught up in this instantaneous gratification, temporalities, and the transformation of temporalities of various forms. So these are some of the issues that get taken up in this session, and I think that this idea that somehow or other capital is actually all about movement, and that we should therefore think of circulation as the total movement, and then think about it as total movement within the spiral form, which Marx again evokes in this section. We've talked about that before: circulation form, the spiral form. So circulation without circulation time is something that he talks about as being very significant, and he ends up with the following conclusion: circulation is not merely an external operation for capital. Just as it only becomes capital through the production process, so does it become retransformed into the pure form of value only through the first act of circulation, while the repetition of this act is made possible only through the second act of circulation, which exists of the exchange of money for the conditions of production and forms the introduction to the act of production. Circulation, therefore, belongs within the concept of capital. So Marx has moved from kind of saying, well, we've been looking at the production of surplus value, emphasizing production as if that is the main form of capital. It has external consequences. But now we see that this is all subsumed within the overall circulation of capital. Now, at this point, we get to the small-scale circulation of labor power. This is a very critical section for me, because in reading the Grundrisse, I made the argument that Marx talks about promotes the idea that you can understand a capitalist mode of production as a totality, which is made up of different circulatory processes. And it's at this point in Capital that Marx actually starts to talk about the different circulatory processes directly. From this, in the next section, he talks about the three primary forms of circulation that he wants to look at. The first is the circulation of capital, which we've been talking about all along. The second is what he calls small-scale circulation, which is the circulation of labor capacity. And the third is the circulation of fixed capital. Now, I can go on and say, well, actually, if you look backwards, you'll see that Marx was talking about the circulation of money way, way back at the beginning, right, in relation to commodities. He's then talking about the circulation of commodities as use values. Then he's talking about the circulation of capital. Now he's talking about the circulation of labor capacity. Then he's talking about the circulation of fixed capital as in relationship to circulating capital. That leads into the circulation of interest-bearing capital, because you can't have fixed capital circulation and all these different turnovers without a credit system, which means an interest rate becomes critical. So circulation of interest-bearing capital. And we can add other circulatory systems that Marx does not talk about, but which are plainly there, such as the circulation of state revenues and the circulation of fictitious capital, which is a category of its own, which comes up in Volume 3 of Capital. But in the Grundrisse, he's only dealing with three. And saying, look, we have to take these three. And the one he wants to introduce here, because a lot of the time, right throughout, we've been talking about the relationship between capital and labor. And he now wants to talk about the circulation of labor capacity. And this he does very explicitly, but you can actually add to it what he actually says at this particular point in the text, other features of the text. And the circulation of labor capacity looks something like this. And there's a diagram of this. There should be a diagram of this behind me. We want the other one. The second diagram. Okay. I'm going to get up and start walk around this, so you'll see better what I'm doing. Let's start on the circulation of labour capacity with the idea of a household economy in which social reproduction of labour qualities and consumer habits, wants and needs are all being dealt with. There's a vast literature now on social reproduction. And so, in effect, it's about, well, what is going on here? Well, one of the things that's going on there is that labourers are leaving their place of work, going back home, resting, eating, socializing, doing many other things. But it's very important that they then go out into the economy. So the laborers are, if you like, at rest. And labor supply starts to move out into a labor market. Now, most people have been in a labor market at some point or other and know what it's like. You don't generally go into a labor market every day, although there are day laborers up the Hudson Valley sort of waiting to be picked up and taken. So some of that goes on. But in a sense, what we're saying is the laborers leave the place of rest and residence and go out into the labor market and experience the labor market. They're looking for a job. Now, this then says we should start to look at how labor markets work. The first thing that could be said, and this is said back about page 200 in the Grundrisse, is that the laborers under capital do not sell their own body, and they have the right to their own body. What they sell is their capacity to labor, which is very different from selling themselves. They're selling their capacity to labor. And they're selling it to capitalists who need certain qualities. So laborers will say, well, I have these qualities or not qualities. People will be competitive, given that they own their labor capacity as a commodity. They are individuals. Therefore, there's a great deal of individual competition in the labor market. I am competing with you. You're competing with me. My group is competing with your group. All kinds of things going on. The genders are against each other. So the labor market is in itself an object of study. And important, and some of the things Marx has been saying about labor markets can be understood, but you can imagine expanding on that considerably in some detail in terms of what is it that goes on in labor markets. There's a lot of discrimination that goes on. There's a lot of nasty stuff that goes on. There's very little collaboration between workers. They are very much against each other's throats. And what the capitalist tries to do is to divide and rule in that market, because the more you can divide and rule, the more you can make sure you can hire people at a lower wage. So there's a kind of a form of social and political struggle here, but it's not pure class struggle. It's in fact individual competition layered in with some sort of class perspective. So that's the second moment in this process of circulation. At some point or other, the laborers get hired and they get brought into the labor process. And again, we don't have to go into that in great detail because, the labor process is a well-known feature. And we've been talking about that quite a bit, but that in this case, the changes in the labor process, changes in technologies and so on, have different requirements for different kinds of labor. So labor qualities vary a lot. There can be on-the-job training as well as hiring and so on. So you see that there's a labor process which produces a commodity which is going to be sold in the market. But at that point, what the laborer gets is money. They get a wage. And they go out of the workplace and they have money in their pocket. What do they do with the money? Well, they can do all kinds of things with it. They can drink themselves silly, or they can, go out on the town and that, or they can behave, quote, responsibly in bourgeois firms, and there's lots of philanthropies around to tell them how to save. You find them setting up penny savings banks for the workers, mutual savings societies, credit unions, and all the rest of it. So there's a moment in which actually laborers command money power. And and you feel pretty good if you go out and you've got, $100 in your pocket, and you kind of, okay, I've got, as Marx says, we carry our relation to society in our pocket, and our power in relationship to society in our pocket. So, but at the same time, there's plenty of predatory activities that go on here. That is, laborers can get into and have their money stolen from them. It can be simply stolen, or the money can be paid in such a way that it's paid to a financial institution, so you have to have a bank account. The bank account costs you money. The financial institution uses your deposit in there to make lots of money, lending to kind of, Elon Musk or somebody. So and then, of course, there are other things that happen here. For example, in our own society, there's the credit card. Well, you always think of the credit card as being helpful to sort of bourgeois consumption, but actually it's been terribly important in terms of working class and particularly lower class consumption. Because if you didn't have enough money to pay for dinner for your kids on Thursday night, you could get it on your credit card and pay back on Saturday. The presumption, however, is that you could pay back on Saturday. Now, what we get is indebtedness coming. And indebtedness is a very important form of power. And it's the power over people. So even though people might be getting a reasonable income, there's all sorts of traps which go on in terms of what happens in the money market. And increasingly people are told, oh, well, Social Security should disappear. You should break your own money. You should invest in your own pension. So you have to start to look after you. And by the way, you get encouraged. What happens if there's unemployment? You should put stuff by for a rainy day. So you get all kinds of things going on at this point. But this is where Marx says something very interesting. He says, when you're dealing with this, you're no longer dealing with, though, the identity of a worker. This is not the workers give up their identity as workers and they become savers and they become money managers and all those kinds of things. They assume a different identity. Then, of course, that money is used to try and buy commodities. And at that point, also, laborers lose the point of being laborers and they become buyers. And they get caught up in all of the struggles that go on between buyers and sellers, and all of the structures of exploitation, profit gouging and profit making and all the rest of it, high rents, rental extractions and all the rest of it. So again, the working person who started out here and got up very happily in the morning to go off is now sort of experiencing this whole kind of set of things going on here. What goes on in buying wage goods and all this. Marx kind of says, well, workers obviously have an interest in sort of not sheer commodities, which are necessities, but also they like to have cultural things, and talks of, and Marx always included in necessities tobacco because he smoked like crazy. So that is where the commodity markets come in, and the commodities then get taken home and people cook them and eat them or use them and all the rest of it. So at that point, the value disappears because it's consumed as a use value. The value is maintained all the way through here. You hope it's maintained if it's not stolen. At this point, it disappears out of the thing because the commodity is used, eaten, worn, or whatever. So this is the circulation of labor capacity. And the thing that strikes me about it, and I think it's something that is really significant. That at each one of these points, there's a different experience. The working person has a radically different experience. And the assumption in most Marxist circles is that there's something called class consciousness that's going to arise. And class consciousness is going to lead to the drive towards construction of socialism. It's a general kind of hope. But the point here is that class consciousness only really arises at the point of the labor process. A sort of shady form of class consciousness can arise around what happens in labor markets. The rest of the time, it's not a class issue. It's what's happening to you as somebody who put your money into a savings bank and the savings bank went bust. Somebody who borrowed a credit card and more credit cards and then found the only way to pay off a credit card was to get another credit card and gets debted, those are the sorts of experiences and can't get out of the debt trap. And then the issue arises politically, what is the most important part of this? In conventional Marxist circles, it would always be, you would come back to the labor process. But I would want to argue, no, it may be the labor process, and nobody's going to deny the experience in the labor process is important. But it may be that you're prepared to put up with alienation in the labor process and rather dire kind of conditions of labor, provided you get enough money to actually be able to bring it home and have a good time at home. And in a sense, that's what capital is constantly offering to people. That is, it's saying, put up with lousy work conditions and look at the cornucopia of products, of commodities that you can get. A fantastic array of commodities. How much has, commodity markets proliferated? Human wants, needs, desires get caught up in all of this. So this is the circulation of, and I think it's a very interesting kind of model to sort of think about and think of its political consequences. I mean, if I was designing a socialist party, for example, I would have commissions on each one of these. A commission to talk about the labor market, commission to talk about labor process, commission to talk about what happens in the monetary form, a commission to talk about and then try to reform the whole damn thing. I mean, that's what I would do, but nobody's going to listen to me, so that's good. But I now want to look at this. This is the general circulation of capital, and I'm sorry you probably can't see it too well, but let me take you through it. Let's start here. Reproduction of labor power. That's like the household. Reproduction of labor power, the labor power is flowing into the production of commodities of value and surplus value. And these commodities are realized and sold in the market. And there are luxuries, wage goods, some of which flow back, of course, to reproduction of labor power. So what we have here then is that they're sold in the market, and some of it comes here in terms of wages, taxes, industrial profit, merchant profit, rent, interest, and so on. So it gets distributed and it flows back in. So what you see here is that this is if you like, the circulation of capital as a whole. And you now see embedded in it this circulation process. Reproduction of labor power, the flow into here, the flow of demand for wage goods, and therefore the capacity to take the money form and deal with the money form. And part of this then is the consumer effective demand, worker consumer effective demand, which then comes back into the reproduction of labor power. So my point here is that these diagrams are showing is a little bit how these two circulation processes mesh in with each other. And I would argue that in exactly the same way, we might want to talk about the relationship between, heart disease and pulmonary problems in a human body, that there are relations between that there are relations between these circulation processes, and that therefore we need to look at the circulatory processes more closely. And this circulation of labor capacity seems to me to be a really interesting way to start to understand exactly how a capitalist economy works, because much of the argument that's gone on in the first part of this section has been precisely about, the relationship between production, which is the sphere of labor, and the application of labor, the relation between that and what's going on in terms of the circulatory process and circulation in the market in general. So one of the ways in which it seems to me it would be possible to proceed here is to start to actually work out the politics of the experiences in each of these different moments. And in exactly the same way, Marx kind of says, well, it's not as if production somehow or other sits in lordship over, circulation. No, they are both moments in a unified process. So we would start to see these different circulatory processes being integrated with each other within the theory of a capitalist mode of production. And that seems to me to be what Marx is proposing in this section. Now, the interesting thing is that you don't really pick up on this idea elsewhere in Marx's writings. So when you go back and you read Marx's Capital, Volume 1, 2, and 3, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, what you do is you find Marx talking about the elements without talking about this integration within the totality. But the integration within the totality would say, okay, I'm going to start to look at the flow of interest-bearing capital. And again, the idea of the totality and talking about the whole as opposed to talking about the individual parts is critical for this part of the analysis. And we're going to do the same thing when it gets to the circulation of fixed capital. That is, we're going to look at a circulatory process that has distinctive features, has distinctive requirements, and has distinctive impacts and distinctive role to play in the capitalist mode of production, but it is integrated with everything else that's going on, and integrated as part and parcel of the spiral form. So this is where I would come down on this, and I like the idea of this circulation of labor capacity. I think it just is a very useful way to start to think about things, but it does have these political consequences. For example, if you kind of say to people, well, what bothers you most about what's going on around you right now? Is it your job or your labor process, or is it the high rents and the fact that rents are shooting through the ceiling and it's hardly possible to find a place to live in New York City, which is the more important and pressing problem. And for me, that is something that is a useful question to ask. There's no theoretical answer to it that says it must be that or it must be another, but there is a practical political situation in which it may well be that, yes, what goes on in the labor process is something that needs to be thoroughly regulated. But right now, we'll find people like Elizabeth Warren talking about consumer regulation of consumer practices and consumer rights and things of that kind. Also in terms of financial regulation and financial rights and so on. And are there ways to set up good institutions, like credit unions and so on, that help people manage their monetary finances in ways which are relatively safe and secure, as opposed to being caught in the latest scam, which has come out, of which there are many in contemporary life. So these are the sorts of issues that this framework sets up, and that's why I'm are a little bit partial to it. So why don't I kind of get some of your responses to this and thinking about this? Anybody got any questions and ideas about it? Or from the text? Yeah. I think we need the...
I just have I've just a sort of a general question about how to conceptualize the selling of capacity to labor, or where in theorizing or in the real world, like because it's not the capacity to labor that does the labor. The body does the labor. The labor happens as labor. It's not just a potential labor. So for me, there's like a break in understanding of the theory between what was being sold is the capacity to labor, but then what's actually being provided is labor.
Yes.
So if you could maybe help me try to understand that a little bit better, like what am I missing that goes between what's being sold and then what's being provided?
Yeah, well, but the labor process is designed by capital. The word I think helps jump from one to the other is alienation. But it's the laborer has a capacity to labor which they could put to work in their own backyard and make things and enjoy making things and have creativity with it and all the rest of it. What happens, however, in the labor market is that capacity to do the labor that you want to do is foreclosed by the fact that you have to do the labor that the capitalist tells you to do. And that is the alienation of your labor. So it is alienated labor as opposed to just labor. And whereas I might be doing the same thing physically in my own backyard as I'm doing for somebody else, but one is alienated and the other is not. So that in the labor process, the alienation is first that as a worker, you do what the capitalist tells you to do in terms of the labor process. Secondly, the product does not belong to you. It belongs to the capitalist. So what you make is not yours, it's the capitalist's. And thirdly, the value in it is not yours, even though you created it, it belongs to capital. That is, the surplus labor, which is the surplus labor time which is available, we dealt with this last week, is converted by capital into surplus labor, into surplus value, i.e. profit and expansion of wealth. So all of those activities are alien, as Marx would call it, are what alienated labor is all about. So the labor market is about the alienation of labor and works on the basis of the alienation of labor. So yes, you're quite right to kind of say, the ability to make something could be appropriated by capital, or it could be you could use it for yourself. One is unalienated and the other is alienated. There's a good question.
I had a question in the text. You were talking about productive consumption and sort of the how labor, in order to reproduce itself, the idea is basically that people buy things in order to reproduce their own labor. And it seems like in that time, like the laborer would probably be doing a certain job, but then, they might be buying food from another capitalist and buying clothes from another capitalist. But does it matter in sort of today where they have like mega corporations where, you might be working for Amazon and then buying stuff from Amazon and buying your leisure from Amazon in the form of television? Like, does it matter, or is it just like the capitalist class in his time would be sort of that entity?
Yeah, I remember in this section, Marx does use this idea that the worker in consuming things is actually reproducing themselves, and in reproducing themselves, they're reproducing capital. So Marx then says, well, that looks like productive consumption. Mostly productive consumption in Marx deals with the situation in which the steel worker makes a steel rod, and the steel rod makes the house. So that's productive consumption. So Marx kind of uses that. I thought this is one of those moments in the Grundrisse where I think, well, he's taken the concept of productive consumption a bit too far, because there's two steps, if you like, in between. So I pushed that one aside when I read that and said, it looks like productive consumption, But what he's really pushing at there, and what I think leads him to probably in a situation like this to overstate the case, is the way in which production and consumption are integrated with each other, and that he's trying to get away from that separation that says it's outside and that's outside, and trying to say, well, it's all inside, and so even the reproduction of the laborer, which is internal to this system, is in a sense about the reproduction of capital. So while it's talking about the reproduction of labor power, he's kind of saying, well, it's a reproduction of labor power, but it's also the reproduction of capital, because labor power is capital. So it is that argument, I think. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Just as the last speaker was saying about the production and kind of consumptive kind of processes that.
Can you talk a little louder?
Just as the last speaker was saying about the production and consumption cyclical kind of nature that you get locked into with capital, it just kind of made me think about you work. You're for minimum wage, you're locked into this wage slavery. You only work to consume, essentially. You don't work for anything else. You work to attain your bare kind of subsistence level, and then you work to become a consumer slave for the sustainment of capital in itself, if you I was just thinking about that with my own labor horror stories, but yeah.
Yeah. The issue here is very much about okay, if you have something like a minimum wage. I mean, one of the reasons why, I like this is somebody comes along and says, okay, we want $15 minimum wage. And Marx has this interesting thing about the relationship between producers and workers, in which he says every producer wants to keep the wages of their own workers down as low as possible. At the same time as they also want their rivals to increase their wages, because that's the only way in which their market is going to be preserved. So Marx has quite a bit in here about workers as market. Clearly, the workers are not a sufficient market for the totality of the system, but they are a very significant part of it. So what happens to the workers in terms of their wages and how much they get and how this, and so there are pressures could emerge within this system to sort of try to raise wage rates. But the point about this is to say, well, what's the point of raising wage rates by 10% when housing rent goes up by 20%? Wouldn't it be more socially efficacious to actually control rents? In other words, where you operate in here, and then there are different capitalists involved here. We're largely with Marx talking about industrial capital. That is the capital that makes stuff, particularly steel and all the rest of it, and blah, blah. So we're talking about industrial capital, but what happens when we're dealing with bank clerks and all the rest of it? And so I think that the real issue is going to be how can we tame this whole system? Now, Marx has, I think, a very interesting suggestion here. Again, it's back a couple of sessions, where he kind of says one of the things that working people have to do is to recognize that they're living life as a process and understand what kind of process they are in. Now, most people are in something of this sort. Most people are in here. And you can imagine reforming it. Let's suppose, Elizabeth Warren comes to power and has a way with everything, so it will be reformed and all of those sharp, nasty things that go on in credit markets will be stopped. Consumer rights will be observed, all kinds of things of that sort. You can imagine reforming this whole system, but only up to a point. So at some point, you've got to say, okay, what happens when you get out of the system? Now, people have a choice. You either go into this system, which is going to give you a wage at a certain point so that you can live, or you've got to find something outside of this system and some way of living outside of this system. And it was interesting that there was always big discussion about the big refusal to come back into work after COVID things started to get moderated. And my feeling about it was, well, a lot of people don't want to get back in this system. It was a systemic thing. It wasn't just, it was a resistance to rejoining this system because everybody lives in this system and knows what happens to you within this system. And yes, you can go and fight for consumer rights or, credit card mediation and all that kind of. You can fight for all those things, but it's one long, fight all over the map. It's not just sufficient to go on strike at the point of production. You've got to go on strike everywhere. And how do you go on strike against some of the abstractions of interest rate formation? And how do you go on strike against the banks? How do you go on strike about the Federal Reserve? So there are all those sorts of questions. So, but when people come back in and get inside of this system, basically, and again, this is the way Marx puts it. He said, when you try to get back in the system, you are effectively told not that you can reproduce the value of your labor power and get your stuff done, and then you go and produce surplus for the capital, because if that was the case, you'd stop working halfway through the day. So I've got my equivalent. So I give me my equivalent. Screw you. No, it's the other way around. Basically, what you're offered is you go and produce me surplus value, and after you've produced me surplus value, you can go and produce something for yourself for the last 4 hours of the day. So, in other words, the way it's usually presented is that you start off and produce the equivalent of labor power, and then the surplus value comes in. But Marx is saying, in practice, it's the other way around. What basically the capitalist is saying to the worker is, you want to join my system? You want to get to the point where you have the right to produce variable capital, that is the value of the wage. If you want that right, then first off, you've got to produce my profit. And it's that way around. And again, Marx kind of makes that kind of comment here, that it's that way around. Yeah.
Yeah, so I used to work as a researcher for a labor union, and the organizing was like at the point of production and, organizing people who were working, and that all made sense. But, our pension fund was reliant on like speculative economy doing well and getting like a good return on investment. And so it was really hard to sort of conceptualize like growing worker power, but then having the future of these workers be so dependent on this like extremely speculative thing. And I just don't know, I sort of don't know how to negotiate that. Like, how does one organize at the point of that speculative credit part where, it's like the banks or investment funds? Is that just like spooky action at a distance, like we were talking about in another class?
No, I think look, there's a big difference between pension funds which are set up in such a way that they have to invest in financial markets and engage in speculative action for the future. There's a big difference between that and, say, Social Security. And there's been a big pressure by capital and by Wall Street to try and undermine more and more Social Security type pensions. For example, until recently, if you were a pensioner in the California educational system, you got a straight pension, which was not dependent upon finance. My pension is I have to put money into a pension fund. For a while I didn't, but then it got mandated that you had to. And so you end up being I'm owner of stocks and shares and all kinds of things like that. And every now and again I go look, particularly over the last few months, and say, oh my God, that's 25% of my pension disappeared, And then it's very interesting. At high points in the private pension scheme, that's when people start to say, look how much better off you would have been if all of your Social Security had gone into the pension things. Right now, it's the other way around. You don't want to talk about it, because. So yeah, but I think what you would want to do is to say, well, people have a right, having created a working life, to a retirement pension, which is not connected to what's happening to their savings in the market, which is not based on speculative activity, but which is based on state funding, which is what the big fight in France is all about right now, because they want it to go from 62 to 64 and so on. So I think we would want to sort of contrast the private. But the private one is good for Wall Street no matter what happens, because the bankers get all their bonuses from shuffling that money around. Even if they make a loss, they get, $40,000 or $100,000 bonus or something like that, fine, for doing almost nothing. And 2007, 2008 was absolutely astonishing. I mean, all the bankers got paid an immense amount of bonuses for crashing the global financial system and dispossessing millions of people of their housing. I mean, this was kind of, it was scandalous, in other words. But I think by thinking about the relations like this, I think it's possible to start to then say, well, what should we do? And in what ways could you rationalize, if you want, the whole kind of question of how money gets used by people who are in this system, but who get very little guidance and are frequently encouraged by all kinds of scams in terms of, the subprime mortgages was a very good example of this. People essentially got into home ownership with zero interest rates and zero payment back for the first 2 years or something of that kind, until it then became market rate, and then the whole thing collapsed. So you could. Why I like this argument is it starts to kind of say, well, where are the possibilities of social action, and what kinds of forms of social action might we do, and what would a labor union do in this situation? Labor unions, for example. There was a time when labor unions would do things like sponsor social housing. So, for example, in Uruguay, there's an extremely good program run largely by the unions where there's collective social housing for the members of the union. And you could do two things. You could either contribute in kind, which meant that you actually were going to be a laborer on the building site, laying bricks and all that kind of thing, or you could contribute financially. And if you couldn't contribute financially, a lot of it was self-built, and the labor process in that case was again unalienated, because people were building their own houses, instead of going through financial mechanisms.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you think this extends to intellectual labor, and especially algorithmic labor, which I think changes a lot of the dynamics of each moment. And some of the things I was thinking of are particularly how when you sell your capacity to work, that capacity is something that's garnered from privilege. It's something that you can, especially in America, you have to pay money to get college educated for, and it changes the dynamics of the labor market. But also how production in terms of like a software developer or someone who's working in data science trying to find patterns in the market to sell to companies, there's no real raw materials there. What they're working with is just data that's been harvested, and then what they sell to is other capitalists who consume, and it just seems to me to change these dynamics a lot, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, confused, I think, is the best short answer I can give, because we will be dealing with this a bit next week when we get to the whole kind of question of the general intellect and how to understand that. Two points I would make. Everything depends on how a firm or an operation which is running an operation is capitalized. And if you start to sort of say, well, its rate of return depends upon the way in which it's capitalized. So you've got a knowledge production structure of some kind, apps or something like that, where you've got a firm there which is having people work on apps and they're selling the apps to somebody. Well, the firm is capitalized. Even though it's not producing anything physical, it can be producing content of a certain kind. And I mentioned the fact that a lot more production these days is towards production of experiences. It's a sort of experiential consumer market, and apps can often be connected with that, in the sense of people will game on their apps, and they entertain themselves with these sorts of things. But what Marx does is to say, in the end, the physicality of the thing doesn't matter. What matters is how you capitalize it and how you set it up, and how it then gets used. So you can have something which Marx actually mentions this. You could have a firm that is almost totally automated, but it would get the average rate of profit, because that's the way the capital works. It works on the average rate of profit, not. So if it's capitalized and it's worth $1 million, you should get a 3% rate of return or a 5% rate of return on that capital. So don't be put off. So if don't get too waylaid by the physicality of what is going on, or the lack of physicality of what's going on. If it's capitalized as a capitalist firm, it's going to really seek to get the average rate of profit, and it should get the average, and it can get the average rate of profit as far as Marx is concerned, even though it's not producing anything tangible at all. In fact, a lot of what is going on right now is this gets you to the question of fictitious capital. That is, you get these things like the cyber currency crash, where there was nothing there. Yet people were making a lot of money out of it, and they did so for some time. And of course, it could go on for a considerable amount of time. And my own sense right now is that much of capital is in fact organized as a Ponzi scheme. You simply, when you run a business and it crashes, and in order to get out of the crash, you create more liquidity. You flood the world with liquidity, and it gets everybody out, and then it goes along and it crashes again. So you have to get more liquidity upon liquidity and liquidity. So the amount of liquidity which is being pumped into the system, and it's interesting because some conservatives are really getting very upset about this, and they don't want to do this because. But on the other hand, this is the way in which Wall Street survives. It's essentially the Federal Reserve creating more liquidity, and we're basically right now the main lever of governance in the world right now, it seems to me, is essentially anchored with the Federal Reserve systems and the central banks, which coordinate. I mean, the central bank telephone each other each morning, and they have a conference call basically to kind of figure out what kinds of fires are going on around the world and what needs to be put out and who's going to put out. And it's the German central bank or the European central bank or the Japanese bank will deal with that, and we'll deal with this one. So I think that I would use very much the categories that Marx uses, and say, well, it's the usefulness of something, and it's in the end, it's what's the use value of the particular firm, and what's the use value of whatever is being produced. And if it's fictitious and people want fictitious content, okay, it'll work.
Hi. So, if I understand correctly, you were saying that, and unlike the classic orthodox analysis and saying, we're saying that exploitation does not happen only where surplus is produced, but also where surplus is realized in the market, through housing, and so many layers and examples.
Yeah.
Okay, that being said, the second point is that we know that wages monetary or social wages, the livelihood of the working class and everyone, and many other things depend on crucially on the bargaining power of labor, of labor unions and political parties. But like, for example, now and specifically in post-industrial, if the term is correct, in post-industrial capitalist markets, like, is the working class also the classic portrait of the working class? Is it still then the revolutionary class, or the class that is capable of holding an alternative project or alternative plan? Or then we should find and answer, when you were answering previous question, you mentioned that, like, striking against banks, striking against the central bank. So to enhance this bargaining power of labor, do we have now to think of something else different than the labor union of working class, or the classic working parties? Is it like about social movements? Like, how do you fight the exploitation, or how you counter the exploitation in the where surplus is produced? Strikes, labor unions, and so on. How do you fight the battle of exploitation where surplus is realized? And is the working class still the revolutionary class?
All along, since my first Marxist book, 1973, I've made the argument that social movements are just as important as trade unions in terms of articulating the pathway towards some alternative. So if you say to me that, well, the only form of exploitation which exists is in the labor process, I'd answer to you, no, I don't think that's true. And I think the socialist movement is undermining itself by failing to take account of some of the problems and issues that arise here. Now, I've made the point that it's very hard to maintain the traditional notion of a working class against a background of this kind. I think even in Marx's time, that was wrong. I think, for example, the Paris Commune, which a lot of people would hold up as a good example of an admittedly failed but important socialist revolution. The first two measures by the Paris Commune was, first, the suspension of nighttime labor in the bakeries, which was a labor question. Secondly, a moratorium on rents, which is... So if you look at the social policies that were being evolved in the Commune, half of them were dealing with the issues and these other issues, and half of them were about the labor process. But the left has this fiction that the only working class that counts is the industrial working class. But of course, the industrial working class has been very much undermined by technological change. The unions are by no means as powerful as they once were. In some parts of the world, they're increasing in power, but generally speaking. And I tend to use, instead of using the word exploitation, because I think the understanding of exploitation that Marx gives is perfectly correct, and I'm fine with that. Exploitation of labor in production and the production of surplus value. I use the term accumulation by dispossession, so that when 7 million people lost their houses, and about 80% of their wealth in the United States in the crisis of 2007, 2008, I would say this is a classic example, and we're going to have to fight against this and not say, oh, well, because it's not part of the industrial working class, it doesn't matter, because it clearly matters, and it's very much embedded in this process. And it was accumulation by dispossession. Because who took over all that housing? Well, one of the big companies that came in was Blackstone. And going back to the union question I had earlier, there was a very interesting case. Blackstone started to pick up all of the housing that was being foreclosed upon. Sitting on the banks had all these houses, which nobody knew what their value was. So Blackstone came along and said, well, we'll pay you $100,000 for each house. The previous market that had been $300,000. So the banks passed over the housing very cheaply to Blackstone, and Blackstone then fixed it up and turned it into rentals and became extremely rich. Then Blackstone also took over some multifamily units and started to evict people and turn them into upmarket housing. A very interesting case came where CalPERS, which is the California Public Sector Union pension fund, was funding Blackstone and funding Blackstone in picking up all these houses, and at the same time taking over multifamily housing and starting to evict people. And some of the people that Blackstone evicted with CalPERS money were pensioners of the California Fund. So in effect, they were put in the situation of accepting their eviction from a housing where they'd lived for, 20 years, on the basis that this would actually keep their pension fund viable. So these things are going on, you see, these are important parts of struggle, of political struggle, and they're not directly labor related. And in fact, Marx says very explicitly when it gets to the fight that goes on between finance capital and somebody else, who is the somebody else? Is it the working class? No, it's the industrial capitalists and the rentiers. So there's a much more complicated picture here. And I think one of the things that comes out of the Grundrisse would be to say, you can't come out of this and say there's only one viable vanguard in the construction of socialism, which is the industrial working class. You can't come out of it with that. There's too much going on. Much too much going on in social reproduction. For instance, I didn't sort of mention it, but part of the role of state revenues is to support collective forms of social reproduction, education, healthcare, for example. And you have to go fight for education and healthcare. If you want decent education and healthcare as part of the social reproduction process, you've got to put up a political fight. And you don't say, well, I'm not going to do it because it's not at the point of production. So what I would want to argue is that there are two ways to attempt to deal with this situation. The first way is to find adequate reforms that can restructure the system in such a way as to at least give adequate life chances to a larger segment of the population than is currently possible. That's one way to go. That is, if you like, the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders kind of way. And I'm not against that because, if you can improve life for 5% of the population or 10% of the population, why wouldn't you do it? And why wouldn't you struggle for it? And furthermore, as you struggle for it, you start to immobilize and you create political power and you can start to move further. The other way is to say, we don't want this system. We want another kind of system. And that was, I think, the sign of the reluctance of many people to come back into the system after COVID was over. And why it is that some people want to sort of try to set up worker cooperatives, solidarity economies. In other words, they're looking for a completely different set of social relations. They want to come out of this system. They don't want to be in a situation where they're being told they have to produce surplus value for capital in order to be able to make a living. They want to do something different. So I think that's the way I would then tend to look at it. And I think there are a lot of experiments around the world where people are trying something different. But when Marx kind of says the working population has to understand its positionality, I think it'd be great if all working population of the United States took a good look at this diagram and said, oh yeah, I see it. I know what's going on. Oh yeah, damn it. I want to get out of this system. But people have to be, want to know it. It has to be there to be known. But the thing that I'm trying to do with this is to say, look, there's ways to use this. And start, therefore, to have, if you like, a collective drive towards in which a socialist party or something starts to look at this whole thing and kind of says, well, we have a distinctive way to do two things. One is we are going to modify this insofar as it's become so hegemonic and so dominant that you can't imagine a world that would tomorrow get out of it, but we can at least reform it and make it more civilized. At the same time, start to really set up alternative possibilities, because we've seen things like, for instance, education and healthcare, which were not being provided as commodities 30 or 40 years ago, but they've been commodified. In other words, we can start to say, I want more and more commodities coming out of this system, which are a part of my life. I want more and more of those commodities to come to me in a way that doesn't involve profit-making, doesn't involve participation in this system. And I think, again, I'm convinced that most people just intuitively understand the nature of this system and what it's about, and don't really want a part of it. And if they do want a part of it, it's because they managed to find some niche within it that allows them to deal with some of the negative consequences, but to have a sufficient lifestyle to live decently. And if people have that, then they're likely to say to you, if you come along and say, let's strike for the socialism of the proletariat, they're likely to say, I'm quite happy with what's going on.
All right, we have one online. Could you maybe say more if there's a decisive moment or logic that has to do with speed or time that defines the moment in the process of production, from production to circulation to consumption?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that. Could you again?
Could you say more if there's a decisive moment or logic that has to do with speed or time that defines the moment in the process of production, from production to circulation to consumption?
Yeah, I think the big problem that's really behind this question is exactly where do you intervene in a circulatory process of this kind. And this is one of the difficulties that comes out of Marx's analysis, which is that if production and consumption are so kind of interlocked with each other and they're both part of what capital is, then how do you unplug them? And how do you attack that condition in which one part is subsumed within the other and vice versa? So I think that right now we have a situation in which there is no coherent movement against any of these features, partly because we've got political gridlock. And where there is movement, it's in the wrong direction, like you mentioned, the sort of struggles going on in France, which are, of course, about pension rights. And again, this is an issue where I think that's probably, in this case, undemocratically, the government just pushed the whole thing through, in spite of the fact that the majority of the population don't want it. We see exactly the same thing happening in this country over all sorts of issues. Gun rights and abortion being the two most obvious and prominent ones. So we are, as I see it, in a situation where there's a great deal of mass discontent. We see it in things like teachers' strikes, university strikes. We're seeing it all over the place. Again, not in the industrial heartland so much as in these other areas, which are about social provision. And part of what the teachers' strikes are about is not simply that the teachers are not paid enough, which they're not, but that the conditions of teaching have deteriorated to the point where they cannot obviously contribute the kind of service they want to contribute. And the same is true of healthcare these days. So with those issues, it seems to me that politics is very much on the defensive. And really however, at a time when actual real politics is defensive in these modes, we need to lay the basis for something alternative, which is why I think we should be thinking about the kind of politics that would emanate from understanding this process of circulation of labor capacity in relationship to the accumulation of capital. And that's about the best answer I can try to give. Okay, we done? I think we should remember, no class next week. Next session is a very interesting one. It's very much about these kinds of questions of why have the logic of value and surplus value when actually technological change is eliminating labor from the whole kind of scene of capitalist production. So it's kind of an interesting kind of set of questions which get set up. And of course, it's also about the study of that other circulatory process, that of fixed capital. Okay, good. Thank you.